Hello, everyone. Welcome to Dorm Room Ventures. Today, I have an incredible guest who is deeply involved in the early stage venture community, not just an investor, but also as an advisor and mentor to aspiring entrepreneurs in the college space. Rob Cummings is the executive in residence at the Apex Center for Entrepreneurs at Virginia Tech, where he helps guide the next generation of founders. He also co-teaches an MBA entrepreneurship class at UNC Charlotte and guest lectures at multiple universities, including Wake Forest and Queen's University. Beyond that, he's had a major impact on startup ecosystems, serving as second chair for the Apex Center for Entrepreneurs and working with organizations like the Pamplin Advisory Council and Venture for America. Rob is passionate about helping college students break into the world of startups, and today we'll be diving into his insights on what it takes to succeed as a young entrepreneur. Rob, thank you so much for being on the show. It's great to have you here.
Yeah, great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Of course, thank you. So before diving into things, I want to hear a little bit about you. How did you get into this space and what really excites you about it?
Well, I was with an early stage startup company way back in the early 2000s, and I wasn't a founder of that company, but I was a member of the management team, and we went through various rounds of venture capital funding, and eventually exited through a strategic process. J.D. Edwards acquired us, and J.D. Edwards was subsequently acquired by PeopleSoft and then Oracle. I went through that whole process, and it was very intriguing to me. But I always wanted to do it on my own. I always wanted to have my own company. And I'm not necessarily an idea person, but I'm a good executor. And I finally found someone that had a really good idea, albeit 15 years later, and we started a business, grew it, took venture capital, and we also went through a strategic acquisition process. And so after doing that, I really wanted to take that experience back to Virginia Tech and work with college students who might be interested in starting their own business, or just like me, it could be they have some interest in starting their own business, but maybe the timing isn't right and they're going to go work in the corporate world for 10 years before starting their own business. So that's how I got involved with Virginia Tech being my alma mater. And, the Apex Center is an incredible resource. I got involved with the Apex Center, and now I've been working with them for about 6 years. And as you said, I'm the second chair. I will be taking on the chair position for the next 2 years, starting in the new Virginia Tech calendar year, which is July 1st. But I'm currently serving as the executive in residence, and I do a lot of calls and meetings with students that have good startup ideas. And last year, I went to the ACC and Venture Challenge, which all the ACC schools were represented except one. And the best student teams from each university competed for a grand prize. Virginia Tech did not win, but we had a great team. And the cool story about Cornucopia AI, who was the team that we took, is that all the founders graduated, but they are still working on their venture. They have corporate jobs, but they're moonlighting and growing Cornucopia, and it's doing quite well. And I have the privilege of it being the founder being headquartered here in Charlotte, so I actually see him at a lot of entrepreneur events, even though I used to only see him in Blacksburg. So it's pretty fun to see that.
Of course, that's great to hear. And I know you mentioned several times a common sort of theme that we're going to touch on a few times here, which is your mention of the Apex Center. Can you touch a little bit more onto that and specifically what your work looks like there?
Yeah, so the Apex Center was started, actually we have a 10-year anniversary this April. But it was started by 4 entrepreneurs that had started a company called Apex Systems. They exited that business and contributed or endowed the Apex Center at Virginia Tech with $5 million to get started. And so that allowed Virginia Tech to start the center, to hire staff, to hire an executive director, and to get office space or space for the students. So that's how the genesis of the Apex Center started 10 years ago. And since then, it's there's a lot of programming for students. There's pitch events, hackathons. There's a relationship with the entrepreneurship club. But really, it's a resource for all of the students to use, both people and physical space, to work on their startup idea. And there's students coming through those doors every day, taking advantage of those opportunities. And not only is there dedicated staff at the Apex Center, but there's a lot of engaged mentors that are alumni of Virginia Tech that spend their time working with students. And so, even though I wasn't involved 10 years ago, I didn't even know about it 10 years ago. Plus, I was heads down with my own startup. About 4 years after its inception is when I got involved. And, the structure there is that we have a team of 4 dedicated resources, and then we have a board of directors and then an executive committee. And the executive committee is the chair, the second chair, as well as the previous chair and one other person. So we kind of guide the operations of the Apex Center.
Sounds fantastic. That's a lot of moving parts,
Yeah.
but you guys are doing great with it. So now, going more deeper into what this episode's all about, the college landscape now in 2025, when people usually refer to startups or entrepreneurs, we tend to think about really the big wave of kind of dot-com bubble sort of entrepreneurs. We think about Mark Zuckerberg, we think about Facebook, we think about, all these great people that built these amazing things, all full of that prestige and glamour and everything it has to offer. Looking at it today, however, really given your experience, one-to-one talking to these startup founders, how have you personally seen it change over time? Does it still have that glamour and prestige? Has it become more accessible? Has it become less accessible?
Yeah, well, first of all, I'd say it's become more accessible because of organizations like the Apex Center. So, I think there's still a limited number of universities that have an Apex Center type of organization, but there's a lot more that exists today than there were 10 years ago. I think you're still going to hear about Facebook started in a dorm room. One of the examples I use in my class is DoorDash. There's a great video called DoorDash, doing things that don't scale. The guys that started DoorDash were at Stanford, and there's a video on YouTube that you can look up where they talk about how they started with Palo Alto Eats or something like that. But again, it was started out as college students. So you hear about those startups. What you don't hear about are the hundreds or even thousands of startups that are coming out of universities that are small and nimble, but maybe haven't hit the big time like a Facebook or a DoorDash yet. But there's those startups exist out there, and I think we'll certainly have some success. What's gratifying to me is to see, I'll use the example of Cornucopia AI again, is that they started it at Virginia Tech. They were a representative at the ACC competition, but they're still working on the startup today, even though they graduated from Virginia Tech and are out in the working world. And so it is a real opportunity to go somewhere if they continue working with it. And I think they have a great chance of success. So I think it's just, with resources like the Apex Center, it's just more accessible today than it was probably 20 years ago. But like anything else, you're still going to hear about the wildly successful success stories. But there's plenty of medium and small success stories that'll be out there.
Of course, and that's a great point. Now, going deeper into what you mentioned and looking at this contrast and these differences, how has it changed not only in the sort of startup landscape, but also how has it changed in the eyes of recruiters for corporate jobs? So, a lot of students that end up doing startups also go into, corporate finance roles. And so has it become something more serious and tangible that recruiters look at, or has it stayed the same? What's the overall lookout on that?
Oh, I think it definitely has some cachet and real world experience. I mean, I can tell you just from doing my own startup that, you're faced with all kinds of decisions every day, and there's no way you're going to get that level of decision-making autonomy in a corporate job. Don't get me wrong, corporate jobs are great, but you're going to have to make hiring and firing decisions. You're going to have to determine, do you spend your money on a 409A audit? There's just a lot of stuff out there that you would never face if you were just working in a corporate job. So if I see a resume that has, hey, I started this business, even if it failed, I love the experience because that means that the founder was exposed to so many different push and pulls on their time and on their energy and their decision making, that I find that candidate more dynamic. I think that most people are probably, in the same camp, that they find that that type of a candidate has a much more dynamic background than, someone that did 3 internships during their 4 years in college, getting experience in different parts of a bank. I just think, starting your own business is much more interesting to a person that's hiring, like myself. Now, probably not 100% of recruiters are going to say that, but certainly in my view, I find it to be, very compelling for a recruiting manager.
Definitely. And you just mentioned, regardless of whether a venture succeeds or ends up, just ending, whether it gets dissolved or if they just quit it. So going more deeper into that, why is it that there's not much of a difference? I know that you mentioned that the experience comes regardless of how it ends up. However, do any sort of blinking red flags show up when a recruiter or anyone in the corporate finance world hears that you had an unsuccessful startup? Or is it just still a green flag that they look at and they see as a success story?
Well, look, most startups fail. And so, you have to be realistic about that. I don't know what the percent is. It's like 80 or 90% fail. So if you had a successful startup, you're going to be in the minority anyway. I think the bigger question that I would ask during an interview process is to tell me basically how far you got, what type of traction did you achieve, and what were some of the really difficult decisions you had to make along the way that made you more of a well-rounded potential employee for what I'm hiring to. So, success or failure, I think there's just some really great skills that are formed by having a startup. Now, of course, if you were wildly successful and sold the business, that's even better. But I think those stories are going to be few and far between. And go back to your last question. It used to be a thing that, if you put entrepreneur on your resume, it would be like, oh, this person's just looking for a job. It doesn't necessarily have a job, so they're going to list entrepreneur. But if you can back up entrepreneur with the business that you started, and like I mentioned before, the traction that you achieved, I think that goes a long way, and it's much more than an entrepreneur looking for a job on their resume.
Of course, of course. And, now that we're focusing on the skills that founders tend to build, looking almost retrospectively, so before any of those skills are developed, given your experience in working with founders and seeing where their venture goes or how engaged they are with it, what are some common traits or trends that you see in founders, specifically as to what their drives are, what their values are, their personality even? What are those sort of common denominators that you see that almost in a way ensure that they're going to have a venture that not per se is going to be wildly successful, but something that they can be consistent with and take further?
Well, I'd say 2 things. First of all, they're willing to knock down any doors, any barriers that are put up. They're willing to knock that down and continue to persevere. That type of skill is just so important. And then just kind of looking, the ingenuity, I think, would be the other thing, is that you've heard the term guerrilla marketing, and that's just an example, like to get your product out there. How do what megaphone do you use to broadcast what your product does and how it does it? And I think what you'll see is when you don't have any money or you have very limited resources to spend, people can be really, really creative in how they market their business or how they do operations. I'll go back to if you watch that video on DoorDash, they didn't have any type of a routing system for their vehicles. They didn't have an order taking system or anything like that, but they were very creative. For example, he uses an example that in order to figure out where all their drivers were, they just used Find My Friends on their Apple iPhone, and so that was how they could figure out who to send to the restaurant to pick up the next order to deliver it based on just looking at a map with Find My Friends. I think that is really interesting, that you're forced to do those type of things when you don't have money and you have to get really creative. And so once again, I think that's what an entrepreneur, especially someone coming out for college, can offer to someone, regardless if they're interviewing for a big company position or maybe to join a startup. But that ingenuity, so to say, that they were able to come up with in order to market their product or to execute, like the examples I'm giving with DoorDash.
Of course, and that's a fantastic point. I think that sort of form of ingenuity is something that, it's one of those things that if you see it in a founder, you can kind of ensure that at least you're going to take it somewhere. I've personally seen it a lot with, my peers and colleagues, whatever it may be. It always tends to, even if it's not a startup, that's always transmuted into some form of success, whether it be a personal project or anything they're working on. Now, going more into that and, from personal sort of anecdotal experience, a lot of these founders tend to have a lot of drive and make sure that they get done whatever they seek to get done. However, a lot of times when we look at the sort of converging point of two founders in this regard, so a co-founder situation, this can lead to a lot of gridlock and conflict. I mean, 60% of, startups fail due to co-founder conflicts. And especially in college, since, everyone's starting out new, they're less experienced in this realm. And this may lead to not only, clash of conflicts, but additionally a lack of knowledge on either hand. Do you have any advice for our listeners on how to navigate the co-founding matching process to ensure that this doesn't happen? And additionally, during the process of working with the co-founder, how to make sure that you steer away from those situations and mitigate its effects?
It's not just a problem at the collegiate level. It's a challenge with any startup. You're faced with a situation where you have to divide up the equity of the business. And you may have one co-founder working more than the other because the other one's still moonlighting with a different business. You may have a co-founder that's putting in some of their own personal money into the business and the other is not. It can be really challenging, and you bring up a good point. What typically happens, let's say you have more than two co-founders, is that, let's say if you had four co-founders, there's a very high probability that one of those co-founders will no longer be with the business as quickly as 2 years into the future. And so you have to plan for that, and you have to set up your business so it can deal with that type of attrition or whatever it may be. So two thoughts there is, number one, when you start dividing up the equity, you need to protect yourself. Or first of all, you guys need to look yourself in the mirror and say, okay, who's contributing money? Who's going to be contributing the time? Put everything on a vesting schedule. So if that person does leave, maybe there's no vesting in Q1, or not in Q1, in year one, so that, no one's necessarily earning any type of percentage of the business. And to pull all of this stuff off, even though it costs money up front, but if you can find a good startup or M&A attorney to work with that has seen this over and over and over again and has some real good examples, or some ways to structure the business so that it can be successful, even if someone left the business or people can get sick, they can be recruited by a different business, they could get burnt out, and that happens a lot also. So there's different ways to protect yourself, but it can also be the demise of the business too, and that's what you have to protect against, because egos can get in the way, or I had a situation. The other thing that I always shy away from is investing in businesses that are a husband and wife combo. I just had in the past year, I had a friend that was a husband and wife duo, and they're getting divorced. And they own 50% each of the business, and the wife wanted nothing to do with the business upon the divorce. But now, 50% of the business is a non-performing founder that is not involved at all anymore. Well, investors don't want to necessarily buy those shares out because they want to invest in a business that's growing, not invest in a business to buy out a founder. So these are a lot of challenges that you're faced, whether you're at the collegiate level or the startup level, that if you have a trusted advisor, such as a startup attorney working with you, you can at least set yourself up so that if these issues arise, you can work through them.
Of course, and that's a fantastic point. And one thing, a big reason why I asked this question is because actually way back when I started my first venture, I actually ran into a co-founder conflict, and it actually ended up almost spiraling worse just because of the fact that we actually didn't have a founder's agreement. And I want to touch on the idea of a founder's agreement because through this example, I just think it's so important because when I was actually founding the company, I had talked to several people seeing, okay, when should we make a founder's agreement? How should we build it? And I was getting a whole plethora of different ideas and advice and things like that. So from your experience, how important is it to have a founder's experience? And more importantly, when should that sort of agreement be established?
Yeah, that's a good question. When I started my business with my co-founder, we did not have a founder's agreement in place. But we did have the discussion of, are we in this to win it? That was the first question. And, we figured out the finance side of things, who was putting in money. And it turned out, I just happened to be 20 years older than my co-founder, so I had more financial resources that I could commit to the business. From a work ethic and work distribution standpoint, we were equal partners. But as far as capitalizing the business, I was putting in capital prior to when he was. So we didn't write that down formally, but we had the discussion as to how that would all work out. And I say we didn't write it down. Actually, when we structured the documents and the capitalization table, we did figure out the cap table, based on actual capital that was was ingested into the business, as well as just he and I splitting time equally. So I guess in the grand scheme of things, I had more equity in the business than my co-founder did just because of the capital that I was contributing. But to answer your question, Zaki, I think that a founder's agreement is a good idea. If nothing else, writing this stuff down on a piece of paper is really good. It also forces the discussion. And I suspect, I didn't have one, so I don't know, but I bet you can find something out there on the web that will give you a list of all of the topics that you should sit down and have a discussion on and document. And if that exists, I would highly recommend it. It's certainly, there's no downside of it, because if you could go through that process and realize you have a big conflict on, for example, exit strategy. Maybe founder number one wants this to be a lifestyle business and take dividends out of the business that allows them to live a healthy lifestyle, whereas founder two wants to build it and exit and get a big check out of it and move on to the next one. Those are two very different outcomes for the founders, and you should have that discussion up front.
Of course, and like you just mentioned, that sort of disconnect between founders can be make or break at times. And going off of that point, it's very important that you find the right founder, co-founder for whatever you're working on. And I bet a lot of the listeners here are in the process of maybe looking for or hoping that at some point they find a co-founder that matches, their drive and their vision and mission, whatever they're working towards. Thankfully, at Virginia Tech, you guys have the Apex Center to serve as almost a natural matching platform for founders. Mm-hmm. However, unfortunately, a lot of other institutions and universities don't have a center like the Apex Center. So how would you recommend to other students a way that they could best find a co-founder and gauge whether that co-founder is right for them?
If they're still in college?
Yes.
Go back to their colleagues from high school. I think it's, they probably hung out with individuals with similar interests back in high school, and maybe that individual's at a college that does have an Apex Center like type of thing. So I can give you a specific example of this. My son's high school, the kids all went to different universities, But they had actually thought up an idea in high school, and one of the kids that went to Northwestern took that idea and ran with it. But when he needed co-founders, he actually reached out to some of his high school mates and said, hey, I'm going to build this at Northwestern University, and I'm going to use their similar resources to the Apex Center, but I'd still like you to be part of the founding team. And I know, for example, one of those individuals went to Wake Forest University. I'm not sure if Wake has a entrepreneur center like a Northwestern or Virginia Tech does, but he was one of the co-founders, even though he went to Wake Forest. So I think, and we're faced with a situation now. We're in the process of selecting teams for the ACC InVenture competition for this year, and one of the teams has a founder at Virginia Tech and a founder at Florida State. So not only is it two universities, but they happen to be ACC universities. So we got to figure that out.
I could only imagine. Yeah, and then, going beyond that, and does that sort of process change for individuals who aren't in college? Let's say they've already graduated, they're working, in corporate. Is it the same sort of layout, or does it differ?
Well, once you're out in the corporate world, you're certainly going to start building up your network, and you're going to have resources from high school, resources from college, resources that you've shared time with not-for-profits, with your business. So your network's just growing and growing and growing. So you have a lot more resources you can reach out to in order to find your co-founder. I just had my co-founder and I. We worked together for a couple of years, and we worked well together. We knew each other's strengths and weaknesses, so it worked really well. Here in Charlotte, we have a pretty active entrepreneurial ecosystem, and it almost works similar to the Apex Center. We coalesce at events, monthly events. We have an event here called Pitch Breakfast, where a bunch of entrepreneurs come together, and it's just an opportunity for 3 or 4 entrepreneurs to pitch their business to professional investors, but it's not an investing pitch. It's just to get feedback and to practice. But there's so many like-minded individuals that go to that event, that go to Pitch Breakfast, that there's countless stories of people finding their co-founder at that event. And so I think any decent-sized city is going to have that type of ecosystem. And if you can find the meetups and the organizations that support that ecosystem, it's a great resource to go to in order to find your co-founder.
Of course, and that's a very great point, especially, like you mentioned, Charlotte, New York City, Washington, D.C., those are all nearby cities that are great for that sort of space. So I know we're talking a lot about, how can entrepreneurs find co-founders, but one point that's often, it seems obvious, but it's often very much overlooked, is how can an entrepreneur find an idea? Now, I've spoken to a lot of individuals and students specifically with that sort of entrepreneurial mindset. However, when it comes to going deeper into discussion, I find that they don't have a direct path or vision or even a strategy to find an idea that they think can be successful. So do you have any advice on that, on how young entrepreneurs can sort of find an idea, and specifically one that sticks?
Well, I wasn't an idea guy, so I needed to find someone to bring me an idea, which ended up happening. So I was in the same boat. Off the top of my head, one strategy would be, and actually I'm speaking with a Virginia Tech student later today, that went to a hackathon, and they came, they had to generate some ideas at the hackathon and then run with one of them, and they ended up winning the hackathon, I guess 2 weeks ago, and now they kind of want to run with the business. So A, that was a great place to go for idea generation, and B, they found some like-minded individuals that may be interested in taking this idea that they hacked together at the hackathon and building a real business out of it. So I think that's an interesting way to do it, because there's all kinds of ideas that are generated out of that. Now, Virginia Tech specifically, we have a couple of different startup showcases. I think you've been through them, and a lot of times there's new ideas that are presented there. And some of those ideas are quite good. And again, it could be the type of thing where the entrepreneur may have the idea but doesn't have the execution chops to run with it and is looking for a co-founder to do that. Well, all of a sudden you're marrying an idea with someone that has certain skills that can actually run with building a product and a business. So there's a lot of different resources, but those are a couple that come off the top of my head.
Of course. And, looking in that space, specifically in general, the entrepreneurial space, people starting ventures, we're talking a lot here at the end of the day about the college startup landscape. But I often find myself, whenever you're working even in the college landscape with ventures and startups, that you end up connecting with people who aren't in college, that have been graduated, that are in corporate finance jobs, that have their own startup. And a lot of times in this space, you often find yourself as a college student thinking that you have in every sort of facet the shorter end of the stick. Do you agree with this point, or do you personally believe that as a college student you have certain advantages over those individuals? And if so, which ones are those? And on the other hand, what are the advantages for individuals starting ventures in the corporate finance space?
Well, I guess a couple of thoughts. First of all, I think you have a lot of resources available to you at a university like Virginia Tech because we have the Apex Center. Not only are we bringing students, staff at the Apex Center, but experienced mentors and alumni that can all help. So I think there's a built-in advantage there just because there's some built-in infrastructure at universities that have something like the Apex Center. So I think that's an advantage. In the corporate world, I think it comes down to the network. You're just going to have a larger network of people you can go to. And it's like I mentioned before, because as you're going through life, you're just building more and more of a professional network as you move into the next stage, the next stage, the next stage, or the next business. I'm actually this weekend, I'm getting together with 6 individuals that I worked with over 20 years ago, and we've remained in loose touch with one another. But these are some of the most talented individuals in that first startup that I told you about that eventually got acquired by Oracle. We all work together there. Now we've all gone our separate ways, and not all of us live in the same city anymore. But we keep up with another, and we're all getting together for lunch this upcoming weekend before the Super Bowl. So that's what I would say post college is just your network is growing and growing and growing. Obviously, I've met a lot of more successful people. I started my business without any of these individuals from that business, so my network has just grown over time too. And I think that's the advantage you get, of course, as you're just out in the working world.
Of course. And actually, I was just thinking, I wanted to touch back on a point previously when we were talking about, entrepreneurs, especially ones that are in college, finding an idea or a space to work in. Oftentimes, when I personally talk to these people, and obviously you have more experience in this regard, they often find that there are so many places in sort of verticals, industries, and niches to work in. From your experience, do you find that certain industries tend to yield better results for college startup founders, specifically, for example, maybe the tech industry, maybe, fashion? What sort of industries do you often see a lot of success in?
Yeah, I'm biased here, but I'd say in technology and specifically in software. I think Virginia Tech has produced some good hardware companies just because of our strong engineering department. But yeah, I think software, and I go back to the hackathons, a lot of times you're building software solutions. And the thing is you can start a software company for not very much money. Whereas hardware, it's going to be much more expensive because you're going to have to assemble parts or, source parts, whatever it may be. With software, you just need servers to host your application and to code on it. So I feel like a software type of startup is the easiest to start if you have the know-how. Now, of course, I've been in and around software my entire career, so that's a very biased thing. But if you look at these hackathons, that's what they're doing in a weekend. A lot of times these teams are coming together, coming up with an idea and hacking, literally coding an MVP over a weekend to showcase how to execute on their idea. Obviously, you're not going to have a working product after a weekend, but it's a great head start, and it's something you can run with if you have the know-how and the people and some servers to host your code on.
Definitely. And going specifically into that sort of software niche that you're discussing, from what I've looked into, there's a lot of competition, not only in the college space, but in essentially every sort of space that you look at all around you. Software is the next big thing, especially with, the rise of generative AI and the like. So going into that, it tends to be very challenging for college startup founders to really excel in the whole space and really shine bright compared to people that are growing at a much faster rate. So what would you recommend to these sort of founders to make use of to use the best form of leverage that they can?
I think it goes back to, and this is the third time I've referenced it on the podcast, but, watch the video, the DoorDash video. I think you're just scrappy when you're a college student, right? You don't have any money, you don't have the resources, and you don't have the infrastructure. So you're really scrappy and willing to try a number of different things out in order to come up with a solution. And that's exactly what they did with DoorDash. They didn't pay for anything. They were using Google Docs for orders. They were using Find My Friends, like I said. They were just scrappy. And I think what can happen when you're out in the corporate world is that you're going to create a startup and you go and put all of this infrastructure in place. And when I say infrastructure, just whatever you need to support your organization, you end up spending a bunch of money, or you get really focused on, I need to raise $1 million to run with my idea. I think the advantage you have as a college student, or just even younger in your career, is that you have no excuse but to be scrappy because you don't have those resources in the palm of your hand. And scrappiness can be really, really beneficial. Some really cool ideas can come out of scrappiness. And again, if you just watch the first 10 minutes of that video, you'll see what I'm talking about. And they put some things together that didn't cost them anything to do it, except for gas of their own vehicles in order to run orders around. But they did it with no infrastructure. And I think that's an advantage they had being college students at the time.
Definitely. And that actually reminds me of a quote that I heard from one of my physics teachers back in the day. He said that the smartest people are often the laziest people because they find the easiest way to do the hardest stuff.
Right.
So I think that's a very, very similar point.
Right.
And so one thing I'm hearing a lot from you, not only in this point, but in what we've been discussing, is that, starting a startup can be a lot of work, and it can come with a lot of obstacles in this regard. And oftentimes, like you mentioned, most startups do fail. For the entrepreneurs, specifically the college entrepreneurs that have experienced startup failure, and they're kind of in that gray area, thinking whether they should start one again or if they've been so kind of demotivated that they don't want to do it any further, do you have any advice for them on how to play the game in the upcoming steps, and specifically what they can do to ensure that they learn from whatever led to their previous sort of startup failure?
Well, I think my advice would be is to look back on what went well and what didn't go well on your previous startup. Write that stuff down on a piece of paper, and try to capitalize on things that you were pretty good at, or that where you were successful. And then in areas that you weren't so successful, be proactive and say, okay, how could I have been successful? Knowing what I know now, how could I be successful? And so, you mentioned in the beginning of the podcast, I teach a class at UNC Charlotte on entrepreneurship. And one of the students in my class described a startup that she and 3 other founders had. And the way she puts it is they put all their energy in building a really, really cool product. But they didn't go out and do any market discovery or customer discovery to see if there was a market and if there were customers that would actually buy what they were building. And so they put all this effort into building this product, and then when they took it to market, they didn't have any buyers. They didn't have any customers. And so they ultimately failed, but now they should go back and say, okay, what do we do wrong? What they did wrong is they went under the assumption of build it and they will come. And that wasn't the case at all. They should have prototyped it and then tested it in the market or found their market niche. And then when they find their market niche, go out to those prospects and customers and try it out on them and make sure that they actually have buyers out there that are willing to spend the money for what they're creating. And so that's just an example of actually that's a pretty typical thing that I would see coming out of college students, is that they make an assumption that they have this really cool product idea, and that if they build that product, that they're going to have customers, sitting at their doorstep. And what you realize, because I've made the mistake in my time also, is that a lot of times what you think people want isn't what they really want. And so you need to iterate on that or scrap the idea and go back to the drawing board. But to answer your question, learn from your mistakes. Just go back and say, okay, if I could do it again, what would I have done differently?
Of course. And going off of that, whether it's someone who learned from their mistakes and they go into a new venture, if they're starting one from scratch as their first one, oftentimes we find founders go into what's called analysis paralysis, where they're doing various different types of research, writing all different sorts of papers, doing all different sorts of analyses, SWOT analysis, all these different sorts of things. And we hear a lot of different takes on whether it's good or bad in the industry as a whole. What's not only your take in this regard, but also your advice? How long should founders spend on doing analysis and research before actually going into the industry and pivoting from there?
Well, I think it's important. I don't know if there's a silver bullet answer that says this is how long you should spend, but you need to do your market discovery and customer discovery before you try to launch the market. Now, you can supplement that research, so to say, by building an MVP, a minimal viable product, for example, or even putting wireframes together, whatever it may be. Whatever type of show and tell you can come up with, I think is a good idea. But I don't think there's a silver bullet answer as to how much you should do, or if you should do none at all. I don't think you should do none at all. I think you have to do those things in order to figure out exactly what your niche is going to be, where you're going to enter. So I don't think there's a perfect answer for that.
Got it. Okay, awesome. So you're saying it's more nuanced in that regard, correct?
It is. I think it is nuanced.
Makes a lot of sense. And then I know you mentioned, the schools that you work with, Virginia Tech, Wake Forest, Queens, UNC Charlotte. One thing that came to mind is, specifically with my experience with Virginia Tech, is that it's one of the only schools that have such an entrepreneurship center like the Apex Center, and extensively the Startup Hokies Incubator. My question is, why haven't we seen that in more other universities? We see the talk of entrepreneurship be everywhere. Why haven't we seen that reflected in the programs that institutions provide for their students?
Well, it probably comes from the top down. Well, I'd say there's two reasons. Is that your dean of your business school, or it could be university wide, has to believe in entrepreneurship, and that schools in general are very research focused, academia focused. So entrepreneurship may not even be on their radar. So they might not. That might not be a focus area. The good news is at Virginia Tech is that we have a dean, Dean Sarker, that was an entrepreneur herself before she got into academia. So she's fully supportive of an entrepreneur center and supporting that. And then I think the second thing is that you have to have the money in order to do it. As we do a lot of awards for different students. We have a dedicated space that costs money. We have dedicated people that cost money also. And so, universities typically are somewhat cash strapped. So it's not like they have extra money laying around to start an entrepreneurship. We were lucky that the founders of the Apex systems, endowed the Apex Center to get it started. Now, we as the board members continue to support. We give annually in order to support the Apex Center. And then Virginia Tech, the university, actually supports the Apex Center with their contribution also. So all those three things, the endowment, donations from alumni, and the university, are the three things that need to come together from a financial resources perspective to make it work. And so, that's why it's worked at Virginia Tech, and it may not work at all universities.
Understood. So it does sound like several moving parts that can, require a lot of bureaucracy, capital, and a lot of planning in general.
Mm-hmm.
So for schools that do have these sort of assets, they do have this sort of money, they have the network, they have all the connections. For those schools that say that it's not a priority for them, do you have any criticisms for that? So, for example, if a dean of that university came up to you and told you that entrepreneurship isn't a priority for their school, how would you personally reply to that?
That's a bummer because it should. But if the dean doesn't, if the dean is very focused on, certain accreditations, for example, that's research driven, it may not be a priority for them. I think they're missing out. Well, I think their students are missing out on the opportunity for entrepreneurship instruction. But I understand sometimes it's more important for a university to be in a top 20 ranking and be really focused on research and producing research, because a lot of times that's the way they're funded. So that might be a priority, and it might even come down from the Board of Visitors that is dictating that that's the way the university may need to focus. If you're a high school student or even a college student that's looking at entrepreneurship, I think it's something you should look closely at, is what universities really support that as a mission. Maybe have an Apex Center-like type of support organization at the university. Off the top of my head, I know University of Maryland has a very strong entrepreneurship program. What I saw at Florida State when I went down there last year for the InVenture, they had a very, very supportive organization. I know University of Michigan does. So I don't know the whole ecosystem that well, but I just hear those schools' name, and then I, personally experienced Florida State when I was down there. So I know that they have strong entrepreneurship programs.
Of course, and going off of that point and also wrapping up, for students who don't have such a center, so who don't go to those sort of universities, or even those who do but simply want to extend beyond them, what is some advice and maybe a blueprint that you have for them? And to follow up on that, what are some things that they should keep an eye out for? So any sort of dangers?
Well, they should transfer to Virginia Tech and further support our entrepreneurship program. I would say then, use your resources within your broader ecosystem where your university may be. So if you're in a very a metropolitan area, there's going to be, for example, UNC Charlotte. I'll use it as an example, located in the middle of a decent sized city. So if you're going to school there and there's no entrepreneurship, you could look outside and find support organizations like I mentioned, Pitch Breakfast and others, and become part of that ecosystem. We would welcome college students with open arms. So you don't have to just be insular with your university. You can expand way beyond your university and talk about your region or the city where you happen to be. And what was your follow-up question on that?
And the follow-up question was, what are some things that they should keep an eye out for? So what are some dangers or, general red flags that they should keep an eye out for?
That's a good question. I would say at a university, is it financially supported? Is there dedicated staff, or is it just something that's on a website to say that they have it? So if there's financial backing and if there's people behind it, then that should should tell you a lot.
Of course. Well, listen, thank you so much for sharing some of your wisdom and advice. I hope the viewers and listeners really got a lot of your great, advice and answers to these questions, and I'm 100% sure that it'll definitely help them throughout their road to pave a great career, not only in college, but beyond in this space. Thank you so much, Mr. Cummings. Have a wonderful day.
Great. Thanks. Just as we were wrapping up here, my dog started acting up. So
I guess that's perfect timing. I guess he wants this to end as well.
So, I look over and he's getting into something. So, so let me go and run and take care of him. But, enjoyed the discussion. Hopefully it was helpful to you.
I appreciate it. Thank you so much and have a wonderful day.
Okay. See you, Zach.
Bye-bye.